So now with that, we learned a lot about structs. There's just one last related feature that I want to cover here before we'll then practice what we learned in a slightly more realistic application. And that last feature I want to cover here is a feature called Struct Embedding. And the idea is simply that you build a new struct that builds up on an existing struct. In other programming languages, like Java for example, where you work with classes, you might know this concept under the name inheritance. Now, struct has no classes and it has no inheritance. But you can still build another struct type that, for example, builds up on that user type and therefore contains all the fields and all the methods of that user type, but also adds its own fields and own methods. And for that here, I'll add an admin struct type, which should be a user, but for this demo here, it should be a user that does not just have all these fields, but also, let's say, an email and a password field. So the admin should have an email of type string and a password of type string. But it then should also contain all the fields of the user struct. And to make sure that the admin struct type has all these fields, you have to embed the user struct into the admin struct. And you do that by simply using the user struct name here in that field list of the admin struct. Now you can give it a name like this, but you can also add it anonymously like this. Now when you create such a struct that embeds another struct, you can still work with that struct just as you do with any other struct. For example, we could add another constructor function here, new admin. So now I have two constructor functions, one for a standard user and one more specific function for creating an admin, where I expect to get an email and a password as a string, and where I then plan on returning an admin value. We could also return a pointer here, but here for the moment I'll just return an admin value like this, and therefore a copy of the admin struct that will be created by this function. Now we could again add validation here and check if email is maybe empty and so on, but here I'll keep it simple since we already learned about this, and I'll instead just create this admin struct here and return it. And now here we can set the email to whichever email we received here, and the password to whichever password we received. And we can now also set all these user fields because we are embedding the user. And the idea is that we have all the user fields as well. Now to set them here in this new admin function, we have to set the user field and set that to a user struct. So to the embedded user struct we want to add here. And then here we can set up first name, last name, and so on. So therefore, of course, this admin function also should accept these values, or we hard code them. For example, here I'll simply hard code the dummy values admin for the first name and also for the last name. And then here for birth date, I'll add dash dash dash, let's say. And for created at, I'll again use time now, like this. And that's how we create such an admin struct that contains a nested user struct. Now, if you would have assigned a name to this embedded struct here, by adding it in front of the type, you would have to use that name when constructing the admin struct. So instead of user with an uppercase U here, you would now have to use whichever name you did assign in your admin struct type definition. And with that, we are creating a new admin. Now we can go to the structs go file and of course create such a new admin, maybe down here. Here we can get our admin by using the user package and calling new admin. And then here we can pass in a dummy email address and a dummy password. This will give us such an admin struct. But at the moment I can't do anything with that admin struct, because the admin struct has no exposed fields. They're all lowercase including the nested user struct. So to expose that, we would have to give this a field name of user starting with an uppercase U, or any other field name here, but it must start with an uppercase U. Of course, we then also must target this new field name down here when creating the admin struct instance. Now, back in struct scope, since I am exposing that, I can access the user struct, and you can see that through that exposed user struct, I can also access the methods that were defined on that struct, like this. And therefore, of course, we can also call clear username and then output the details of the admin again. And now with that, we created the admin struct that embeds the user struct. We created this constructor function for this struct, and we're using it here. Let's now see it in action. For this, if we run the application, I have to enter my name, of course. That didn't change, but this is still for the regular user. But if I now hit enter after entering the birth date, I am getting that admin data here. And you see that the methods I defined on the user struct also work on the admin struct. It outputs the data and it cleared the name of the user. So that all still works. Now it can be a bit annoying to always have to call these methods on this nested user field. And that's why you might prefer anonymous embedding over explicit embedding, where you add such a field name. And therefore here I'll get rid of that field name. The code for creating the instance doesn't change, because if it's anonymous, you still have to repeat the type here as a field name when creating this. But now back in structs.go, this code still works, but now we can actually also call these methods directly on the admin struct itself. Because when using anonymous embedding, you can access the fields and methods of the embedded struct directly on the struct that's embedding the embedded struct. So we can now access all the fields, if they would be exposed, of the user struct and the methods of the user struct directly on the admin struct. And that's what I'm doing here. So with that, this code got a bit more concise. And if we again run the application, it therefore still works as before, as you see here. And that's how you can build structs based on other structs, and how you can then access the nested methods and also fields if they would be exposed, how you can add such a constructor function, and how you can therefore in general write more flexible code.